leaders of the world. Welcome to Spread Love in Organizations, a podcast for purpose-driven healthcare leaders striving to make life better around the world by leading their teams with genuine care, servant leadership, and love. I'm Naji, your host for this episode, joined today by Elizabeth Sawin, founder and director of the Multisolving Institute. Beth is an expert on solutions that address climate change while also improving health, well-being, and equity. She developed the idea of multisolving to help people see and create the conditions for such win-win-win solutions. Her work has been published widely. She has trained and mentored global sustainability leaders in the Donella Meadows Fellows Program and provided systems thinking training to both Ashoka and Dalai Lama Fellows. Since 2014, Beth has participated in the Council on the Uncertain Human Future, a continuing dialogue on issues of climate change and sustainability among a select group of humanities scholars, writers, artists, and climate scientists. A biologist with a PhD from MIT, Beth co-founded Climate Interactive in 2010. She has 2 adult daughters and lives in rural Vermont, where she and her husband grow as much of their own food as they can manage. Beth, I am so excited to have you with me today. First, I would love to hear your personal story, from biology to climate change, being part of the UN Convention on the Climate Change. What's story behind this impressive work?
Yeah. I guess, it's always a challenge to think where a story starts, but I would start it as a little kid who just played in nature a lot. I was the kid with the rock collection and the seed collection and playing in the brook. And so that led me to an interest in science. As an undergraduate, I studied biology and chemistry. And I followed those 2 threads to MIT, where I studied neurobiology. I worked on a small soil organism, a nematode called C. elegans. This was in the late 1990s. And the research question we were interested in was about learning and memory. And the fascinating thing about this organism, is so beautiful. It's a transparent, about 1 millimeter long worm. It has a limited number of cells, a little bit more than 1,000, and they're the same in every single C. elegans there is, and they have 302 neurons, very specific number. Each one had a name. That was work by my PhD advisor and his colleagues to make this map of a nervous system. So I had a little tiny piece of that to try to understand learning and memory and how neurons connected to enable this organism to navigate its environment. And I loved the organism. I loved the research. A lot of it was very quiet, actually, because I had to work in a dark room at a cool temperature, like 45 or 50 degrees. I did lots of microscopy. One experiment I did was using a laser to kill single neurons and try to understand how the behavior changed. So in some ways, that's a big departure for where I sit now, 30 plus years later, right? Leading an organization that works on sustainability, health, climate change, equity, and justice. But I think the threads are still there because I was studying a system and I was really interested in the whole system. How do you put 302 pieces together and get emergent behavior? So that interest in systems led me to start following the work of one of the most important mentors in my life, which is Donella Meadows. She was the co-author of a book called The Limits to Growth, which is actually the 50th anniversary of that book just this week. So that was the first real global modeling study that used systems theory and computer simulation to look at what at that point was, something off in the future. They were asking the question, the human economy is growing exponentially on a finite planet. What are the scenarios for that? Like, Obviously, it can't keep growing forever. Are there pathways to fit within the economy, within the Earth system? And in 1972, there were all kinds of options. Of course, today we know that the advice of those authors didn't really get taken by the world, and we're all living through some of the implications of that. So while doing this research in biology, I got to know Donella Meadows. I was interested in systems theory, and she was starting a research institute in 1997. It was called the Sustainability Institute, and she needed a group of young researchers because there was more work she wanted to do in the world than she could accomplish as an individual. The only problem was, I knew a lot about biochemistry, genetics, and neurobiology, and she needed people who could make computer simulations of complex systems. And so this is one of those leaps of faith in a career, because she said, well, I never studied systems theory as in a formal way. Her husband at the time, Dennis Meadows, was a PhD student at MIT studying systems theory with Jay Forrester. And Donella taught herself systems theory at the kitchen table using Dennis's books and notes. So she was like, I taught myself, you could teach yourself. I was like, oh, okay, I'll teach myself. Now I look back, she's probably the most brilliant person I've known in my life. So the fact that she could teach herself something was not like a universal that anyone, including me, could just sit down and master that. So it was a very steep learning curve. I did take a few classes, and I learned the basics of the math and the computer science to build what we call system dynamics computer simulations, which are ways to use computers to handle the complexity and the interconnection of the world. There's more of it than we can mentally simulate, which is one of the reasons so often that our systems, whether they're families, organizations, countries, international relations, things go off the rails because of that complexity, because of especially feedback loops where we make changes in the world and then they feed back in ways we don't expect. So that was a big leap for me from biology to sustainability and systems theory. That led to, so many other important things in my life. One is where I ended up living and raising my family, because Donella Meadows was really committed to the theory of sustainability, but also the practice of it. And so she had a vision around that same time in the late 1990s of a community of people living more cooperatively than most Americans, sharing land and resources and practicing sustainability to the extent they could. So my husband and I got inspired by that vision, and we joined as some of the founding members of that community where I still live in Vermont. So it's 23 families on 280 acres that, far from perfect, but we practice and learn about, everything from sustainable energy to composting toilets to energy efficiency and agriculture. So that's been a really important through line of my life, is the more grounded practice of what does sustainability mean. And then, of course, this introduction into the world of systems has framed pretty much everything I think about, our work in the world, but also how we try to organize and participate in teams and collaborations with just this underlying belief that the world is actually a unitary, complex system. The boundaries, whether they're between disciplines or nations, are usually, we call them mental models, things that human beings have made up, but they're not the physical substance of the world. There's between Russia and Ukraine, because we're talking right now at this moment with the world's attention there's a line on a map, but in the ecology of that part of Europe, there's no line, right? And of course, anyone who's been to space and come back and told the rest of us what that feels like, that's one of the most pronounced things that those explorers of space say is, this small unitary Earth that we all share. So that journey through Sustainability Institute eventually led to a project at Sustainability Institute called Climate Interactive. which grew to the point where it became its own organization, where I was a co-founder along with Andrew Jones and co-director until a little more than a month ago. And most of those years that Climate Interactive were focused on these same type of computer simulations focused on climate change and what countries and businesses and leaders could do to meet climate targets. So we use computer simulations to help people ask really fast what if questions. What if China rapidly decarbonized? What if the United States switched to all electric vehicles? Questions like that. And playing that out for the 100-year future. What would temperature and sea level rise and droughts and air pollution look like under those different scenarios? Which was fascinating. Just like I loved the biology and the intricacy of that one organism. This is a different kind of intricacy of trying to represent, the whole global economy and the whole planetary climatology. And that work led to so many fascinating places, including, you mentioned the UN climate conferences. For a group of scientists, to find our way into advising some of the world's governments and civil society, and also, journalists who are telling the story of these meetings. One role that we ended up playing was saying, if all the countries in the world accomplished what they're promising, because in these negotiations, countries each say, they're going to reduce their emissions by a certain percent at a certain time. And we became really good at asking, if every country did what they said, what would that mean for the 100-year climate future? Would we meet the goals that they said they were making these pledges for? And year after year, our message there was pretty much, you're making progress and there's further to go. And I got really frustrated, to be honest, like saying that year after year, because how urgent these issues are. We don't have time to just slowly make progress and have further to go. And every year of delay means like losses and suffering, right? It means communities and ecosystems that we can't recover. That, I guess that frustration gave birth to the final strand I'll tell you about, which kind of leads up to the present moment, which is this idea of multi-solving. Within the climate negotiations, there's kind of a laser-like focus on the greenhouse gases, and particularly on CO2, which is in some ways as it should be. Like, that's the source of global warming is CO2, and countries need to come up with ways to limit that. But we've been talking about complex systems and interconnection, and of course CO2 doesn't exist in a bubble. It's connected to fossil fuels, which end up, having other impacts than just CO2. And I know a lot of your audience comes from health, so of course people know about air pollution and all of the impacts on developing embryos, on people's circulatory system, their respiratory system, their nervous system. But in the space of talking about climate, all of that's often ignored. And so you have two problems that could be improved at the same time by weaning countries and economies off of fossil fuels. But, and this is improving, but it's still far from where it could be. Too much of the time, those are two separate conversations, with public health thinking about air pollution and climate and energy leaders thinking about transportation and the global climate. And that's really important, because by bringing issues like that together, you bring together timescales. The health impacts are often a lot quicker. We've been talking about the 100-year future when it comes to climate, but if you remove tailpipes or coal-fired power plants, the air in a community gets better in days to weeks, and incidence of things like asthma gets better on that same kind of time course. So bringing these issues together can help with this problem of long-term problems are hard to face. Politically, they can be hard to get the energy for. You can combine that with short-term benefits. And the other thing you start to pull together with more of a whole system view is the costs and the benefits. We have to spend money, time, and effort to build a low carbon energy system. But what we would get on the health side, and the World Health Organization has been saying this since 2018, the health benefits outweigh the costs of the energy system transformation expenses. But when those two things are in silos, then the net win overall for the whole system, it just stays out of reach. So multi-solving is this idea of solutions that tackle more than one problem at the same time. And as of a month ago, that work on multi-solving, which was incubated at Climate Interactive, now is part of a freestanding organization called the Multisolving Institute, which I'm the founder and director of. So
Thank
that's
you so
the
much.
Long and winding story.
Oh, it's an amazing, inspiring story, Beth. Thanks for sharing part of your story and journey. You ended with the Multisolving Institute, so let's double click on this. And I remember when we first discussed about it, you gave an example of a simple town with bicycles, and then with system dynamics, the impact overall about it. And you kind of touched it, and you really frame it as a win-win-win solutions. So can you tell us a little bit more, this story or any other story where you think we can have immediate impact, in fact, and in the world?
Yeah, multi-solving definitely is best communicated through stories. So I'm glad that you asked that. And one of the things that we do at the Multisolving Institute is collect case studies that show the variety of possibilities. So maybe I'll just mention a few that my colleagues have researched that are some of my favorites. One is a project we learned about in New Zealand called Warm Up New Zealand. And it was a response to the energy crisis, or sorry, the economic crisis of 2008, 2009. So it was meant to be a jobs program for the construction industry in New Zealand to upgrade homes that were energy inefficient. And it was successful at that. Homes got upgraded, there were good jobs. And so that's a win, right? But we're talking about the win-win-win, as you said. So one interesting thing that happened was researchers from the health side looked at the residents in these homes that had been upgraded, and they tracked things like emergency room visits, hospitalizations, and the costs of medications, and found really remarkable savings on the health side. And that's simply because people were living in more comfortable, less drafty homes, potentially with better air quality. And so there's the second win, and they've developed that now so that they've included public health leaders and primary care physicians. People through this program, we understand, a doctor can refer patients for home energy upgrades, right? So we laugh about, instead of take an aspirin and call me in the morning, it's like go get new windows and a new boiler. And so that's an example of this stretching across boundaries that we're talking about. And the power of these solutions, really the engine that drives them is people being able to connect across these sort of arbitrary made up lines in the world, right? When we say this is the Department of Energy and this is the Department of Health, and they're in different buildings, and the people have different training and speak a different technical language and likely don't know each other. And so those are all hurdles that have to be overcome by people leading this type of work. Do you have space for another example, or is that one?
Yeah, please.
Well, one that has my interest these days is happening, I think, around the world. In the United States, there's 19 different states experimenting with electric school buses. So the first real advantage of electric school buses is for the children who are waiting at school or on their corner in their neighborhood and breathing in diesel exhaust fumes from traditional buses. And kids are right at that level of where the air is the most polluted. So an electric school bus removes right away some of that burden of air pollution, which has so many health impacts on people. But the other thing that can happen is during the parts of the day when the school buses aren't in use, they can be charging, but they also can be connected to the grid as giant batteries. And we know that part of getting a really clean energy grid is using these intermittent sources of power like wind and solar. And so there needs to be a smoothing process to balance out demand with generation. So school buses or any kind of are also big battery, right? And they can be used to help smooth out those highs and lows. And the other thing that they are is mobile batteries. And so in instances where there's impacts like climate impacts, say a storm that takes out the power grid in a place, you can send fleets of electric school buses, which then can be used for people to charge their phones or keep their medicine cold or whatever is needed in a community after a disaster. So, these are pilots. People are trying to figure out the budget, how to make it all happen. An electric school bus is more expensive right now than a diesel bus, but it shows you how you can put these really different problems together. Like on the face of it, you wouldn't think kids with air pollution getting to school is connected with making the electricity grid work better. But this is some of the just innovation that's bubbling up all around us right now.
I love it. And you said arbitrary lines in the word. I love how you framed it. When we start taking off those lines that we created, obviously, we can imagine the possibilities and what we can do.
That's the human element of multi-solving, right? Because it's human beings who transcend those boundaries.
Yeah, agree. So what about leadership? As we're talking about human being, do you see Multisolver as a key capability for a leader in the 21st century?
Yeah, we're really curious about this, and we think of our role as I think the contribution that we in our little institute can make, or one contribution, is to look across these examples of multi-solving and really try to notice what are the attitudes and approaches that are enabling this way of working to happen. Even from those two examples of home energy upgrades and electric school buses, you can start to see how the variety, we haven't talked about agriculture projects and walkability and cycling and photovoltaic farms. Like there's endless variety in the what of multi-solving, but the common threads seem to be about the way that it happens. And so that is, of continuing interest to me, is how is that way different than the sort of status quo way within our dominant culture and institutions. And I don't feel like we have it, 100% understood yet, but some patterns are emerging for us. One of them, I would say, is that multi-solving projects tend to start small and iterate and be really led or driven by a learning approach and by curiosity. And so you might think, well, there's all these different players involved and there must be some giant vision about how to put it all together and how to convene it all. That's not so much what we see. We see sometimes just a few people working together in a small way, having some success, sharing what they're doing, which builds excitement, which pulls more partners in. And so they try a little bit more. They carefully measure and document the impacts they're having. And that's part of the driving force that allows projects to get kind of accrete more and more energy and attention and collaborators. So I would highlight that as kind of both a learning attitude and an openness to kind of reach out to others. We also see, I'm trying to think how to turn this into a positive. I don't quite have it, so I'll just say the reverse. People who are too attached to the identity of an expert is actually counter to multi-solving. You need expertise, like there needs to be someone who understands the power grid in that school bus project I was talking about. But you also need curiosity about the parts that you don't know about, right? You need the transportation planner who's like, tell me more about public health. I don't really know what air pollution does to somebody's lungs. And you need the public health expert being like, what are the obstacles to redesigning our streets? So maybe you could just really emphasize, I guess, the role of learner versus the role of expert, and a certain kind of humility that I think is really needed for these projects.
Thank you for that. It's these are so powerful, and I love the framing within expertise, but also curiosity for the things we don't know. So it touches the humility side of things for us to be able to multi-solve in a dynamic world.
I think there's one more. Can I add? Because I think it's so important. One more to add. All of these projects are playing out against a backdrop of a world with all different kinds of inequities. That's just the nature of our world right now, whether it's racism and white supremacy, or patriarchy and gender inequity, and so on. Different places, the inequities are different, but they're part of these systems we're trying to transform. And for multi-solving to be effective, leaders have to be willing to grapple with those inequities and make disrupting those inequities part of their strategy. Because multi-solving is about healing fractures in this kind of way we've drawn lines and broken systems into parts, inequities of all sorts do that same thing. And so the people who have historically been marginalized or disenfranchised from decisions about the infrastructure, say in their neighborhood, need to be included in a multi-solving project. And so right away you have potentially, experts with economic, political, credential power needing to work together with neighborhood residents, say, who might know the most about, what the problems are and what the potential solutions are. And so people need support and skills and patience for working together across those boundaries and dismantling them as they go.
You worked, Beth, closely with Donella Meadows, and you shared in the beginning her book, The Limits to Growth. So she's an incredible thinker, teacher, researcher, and leader. I read one of her articles with the title, There Are Limits to Growth, but No Limits to Love. So I was intrigued to hear from you about this title, and also love and system dynamics for a sustainable world. Like, what does love get into this?
Yeah. One thing that really interests me is, for sure, Donella Meadows, but other systems theorists too. I think of Gregory Bateson, who wrote several articles about love, who was also in that even earlier than Donella Meadows and her colleague, one of the kind of founders of systems theory. And then for Donella, or Dana as we called her, she was very forthright of talking about love, which was and is unusual, right, for a highly credentialed scientist building computer simulations, very rigorous and analytical, to also be talking about love, which is so often not in our scientific discourse. Donella died far too early. She died in her late 50s, and I had only been working with her for, a few years. I thought I would have a whole career to learn from her. So I never asked her why love was such a prominent thing, but for her. But you're right. In addition to that article you name, in the follow-on books to The Limits to Growth, one that's called Beyond the Limits, which came out in 1992, there's a chapter that's about what do we need in order to address the sustainability crisis. And she named, I think it's 8 different things, vision and networking. I can't give you the whole list, but one of those is love as well. Another thing about her is, and I've only reflected on this in hindsight, but any email that she would send, and it might be like, I question the parameters in equation number 45 of your model, would be love, Dana, which is a a countercultural thing to do. Certainly my MIT professors didn't write emails, sign emails like that. But so all I have is my theory. I guess I would say I've thought about this a lot, like you, but I never got to ask her. So these aren't her words of why love became such a force of her thinking. But I have put myself in her shoes, and you have to picture 1972. They were very young, these authors of The Limits to Growth. I think they were in their early 30s. Such important information for the world at a time where if they had been listened to, the tragedies that we're living through now, the floods, the fires, the diseases, wouldn't be happening, right? We would be 50 years later coasting into an era of balance and sustainability. It probably would have taken these 5 decades. So knowing what was at stake, knowing that there was an alternative, knowing to some extent the suffering that would happen by not being listened to, and you're not listened to for decades, right? To keep going under those circumstances, I can't, imagine the loneliness of that. Like those of us working in climate and sustainability today often, I think, feel lonely and feel like we're not listened to, and yet our movement has millions of people, and this was planting the very first seeds of that. So I think she was looking for what is the force that can bring the human global society, to safety. And the other thing she wrote about a lot, you might know this, is about worldviews and paradigms. Because I think what they experienced was what they were saying, and those scientists couldn't connect because people couldn't imagine that this life based on extraction from the planet, that they couldn't even imagine alternatives to it. And so I think talking about love and talking about being motivated by what matters most to us was the best solution she could come to, for the transformation that was needed. And I think the reason love shows up so much in this discourse of systems theory is that when you work with systems, you see the interconnections. You see there is no separation. And so, whether it's domination that happens in a workplace with an abusive boss, or domination that happens between one ethnic group and another, there's no systems basis to justify that. And so I think also this tension between how the world was and what her systems models were telling her, the reality of the world was, resolved itself somehow in this through line that she used the word love to describe.
I will move to a section where I want to give you a word and would love to get your reaction to it.
Sure, that sounds fun.
So the first word is leadership.
Open and available.
What about sustainability?
I would say rejoining the flows and networks of the earth.
So I want to double click on this one.
Okay.
What should we do as leaders, personally, individually? Like, what is the first step that I should be doing towards sustainability?
Well, the beautiful thing is that because sustainability touches everything, it's literally how are we on this planet and how are we with each other, that, whatever field we're leaders in, there is a connection to sustainability. You can find all kinds of lists of, flying less is more important than getting solar panels. And so I'm going to not go to that level of detail. And maybe because we've been talking about both love and paradigm, I'll put forth a way that I think about it. Right now, I believe that among our societies, there's two different worldviews that are battling each other. One sees humanity and the earth as a pyramid. It has white men at the top of that pyramid, and then white women, and then people of color with animals and plants somewhere down below. And that theory has, of course, comes with colonization and empire, and has been dominating most of Earth for 500 or so years. But it is only a theory of how the world works. There's another way to see how the world works, and many wisdom traditions and indigenous cultures are embedded in this worldview and carry it forward and live it today. And I think of that as an interconnected web. So there's nothing on top, and it's all connecting and flowing in all directions. I attribute most of the crises we're in as coming from the fact that pyramid view doesn't actually match reality very well at all. Because in fact, if you look at biochemistry or climatology or ecology, it is all this flow and interconnection that we've been talking about. But whether it's the extraction of natural resources or the extraction of labor from people that you somehow deem, beneath you in that pyramid, and it could be literally slavery at certain points in history, but just as well, unfair labor practices. So there's this extraction from nature and people falls out of that pyramid view. It creates crises because the world isn't a pyramid. The world is an interconnected flow, and there is no other, and there is no away. And so I am trying to work my way back to your question of what can leaders do, and what I would say is occupy that worldview of interconnection of a web. And the beauty of that is that you're going to have 100 times a day to do that. Maybe it is, choices about your physical plant. Okay, so your physical plant is part of an interconnected web that includes all life and all flows of carbon, oxygen, nitrogen on Earth. If you're thinking of it as an interconnected web, you're going to think about the circular economy. You're going to think about very intentional use of energy and materials. So you're brought to sustainability. But your next meeting of the day might be staff meeting with your team. And are you going to conduct that as though your company is a pyramid with you at the top? Or are you going to conduct that as an interconnected web of mutuality and responsibilities to each other? Which doesn't mean there's not authority, right? There's situational authority. If you are the founder or the director or the senior member, you have experience and responsibilities. So, it doesn't mean all decisions will be by consensus, but it means you're thinking about that staff meeting in a way where all voices and all, there's a climate for all of the voices to be heard, even if the decision may or may not be by consensus. I hope that makes sense.
That is super powerful. See, stop seeing the word through a pyramid lens and just extraction, as you said, of labor from people, nature, but more an interconnected web. It makes more than sense. I think it's a responsibility we have to think that way as leaders. Thank you for sharing this, Beth. On a related topic that you also work on, the next word is equity.
Well, of course, equity is completely related to what we've just been talking about, a world of a pyramid versus a web. The inequities around us are justified by different theories of supremacy that are, if you've been socialized in the dominant culture as I have, so white woman in the United States, two of the most important ideologies of supremacy are white supremacy and male supremacy or patriarchy. And those have to be grappled with, unlearned, brought out into the light where we can see them, because of course they're not justified by the Webb view of the world. Yet all of our science, from particle physics to ecology, says actually the world is this web. All of the consequences, from climate change to lead in drinking water to child labor in different parts of the world, all these horrors that we say we want to, quote, solve, are justified by these ideologies of supremacy. So equity is choosing to reject those ideologies and to live in ideologies of gender equity, of racial equity, of ethnic equity. And in systems theory, we talk about the interplay of worldview and systemic structure. And by systemic structure, we mean physical things like how our cities are constructed, but also laws and rules and incentives and investments. And so because we're at a point of 500 or more years of those ideologies, everything we inhabit is shaped by those ideologies of supremacy. And just like one example, in the United States, the urban heat island effect is when parts of a city are warmer because of all the buildings and pavement. And that can be counteracted by greenery, especially by trees, which help cool the environment. So it's an important climate change solution. And recently, people have been looking at maps of urban tree cover. And in city after city in the US, those maps superimpose with a great amount of alignment over maps of historic redlining, which are the places where, especially via lending practices, African Americans were prevented from living in certain neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods are the ones that today don't have tree cover. So that's just an example of how the structures, we may feel like, well, redlining doesn't exist anymore, and many of those policies are no longer on the books, but yet in the trees, in the structure of the city, that inequity is still there. So if you're going to address climate change and adapt to climate change in a way that dismantles inequity, somehow you need to bring the community together to grapple with that fact and look at that history and figure out how to make amends or reparations for it. And that's still far too rare, in our discourse. And time is getting really short. The IPCC report that came out Monday last week, ends with these lines about a shrinking window of opportunity to preserve a livable climate. Like, those are the words of the scientists: shrinking window of opportunity, livable climate. But when you start looking at it with this lens of a web and not a pyramid, then you can understand why so many, especially environmental justice leaders, say that equity is inseparable from addressing climate change. And I think this one example with redlining, but we could look at other studies that show that in the US, people of color breathe in more air pollution than their economic activity produces, and white people breathe in less air pollution than their economic activity produces. Or we could look at how refineries for fossil fuels that produce all kinds of toxic chemicals like benzene are predominantly situated in neighborhoods of people of color. So these things are tangled together, and like any systems problem, you can't separate them, and you have to zoom out enough to see how they all fit together.
Yeah, and those are, the systemic type of inequities. We can see it in healthcare also, as you mentioned, like from pollution to also health problems. So yeah, definitely something to keep in mind as leaders as we move forward and start with.
Yeah, and we should name the pandemic as well, right? Which just has revealed again and again the inequities that tie all of these problems together.
Yeah. The last word is spread love in organizations.
Well, it's an interesting question for someone who's 1 month into starting a new organization. One of our aspirations is to not instruct the world to do anything we're not willing to do ourselves. Right now, ourselves is a team of 3, it's me and 2 colleagues, and we have plans to grow. And so we're also thinking about welcoming new people. We're thinking about setting the patterns that we want to have as we welcome new people in. And our touchstone kind of goes back to the beginning of our conversation of these attitudes that we are seeing promote multi-solving. And so be a learner was one of them. Bring your expertise, but not your identity as an expert is another way to say that. I'm creating a white-led organization, at least for now. I'm the director, and I'm white and middle class, and I'm talking about multi-solving only being effective when you're conscious about equity. But we also know about systems and worldviews that it's really hard to see worldviews, especially if you're more a beneficiary of them than someone who's felt the sting of them. So I'm thinking a lot about creating the conditions where my own worldview and blind spots don't hamper our effectiveness as an organization, that don't create, for lack of a better word, white culture in an organization that hopes to have a team that matches the diversity of the country. So I don't have answers to most of these. Most of them are, questions to discuss more at our retreat, or things that I know I need other people to help me with. But I think the lucky thing for us is that by learning from multi-solvers, we have at least some amount of focus on, what we need to pay attention to and be deliberate about.
Yeah, and I'm eager to see how your organization will grow. It's such an important topic and capability, or even leadership principle to work on. So I'm eager to see how your organization will grow and help the world be a better place. Any final word of wisdom, Beth, for the leaders around the world?
Maybe only just to leap across a little bit, because healthcare is a focus of your work and your podcast. I think there's a lot I have learned from your field when I think about social determinants of health and the phrase creating a culture of health. In some ways, I feel like health thinkers, thought leaders are a bit ahead of the climate space in understanding the ways in which the conditions in our system create outcomes like health, and maybe more of a whole system view sometimes. So I don't know if that's a word of wisdom or more just a shout out to say that I see a lot of potential from the climate movement to learn from some of that thinking, and for me, myself, to learn more from it too.
Yeah, and as we discussed before, I think we also have a lot to learn and contribute to what you're doing, because as you said, when we think of it from an interconnected web, every single example that you gave today touches health at some point somehow,
right,
and touches climate and everything we talked about. So yeah, looking forward to your work, and I'm sure you will be working closely with healthcare leaders too. Thank you so much again, Beth, for being with me today and for having this amazing discussion.
Yeah, thank you. This has been great.
Thank you all for listening to Spread Love in Organizations podcast. Follow us on LinkedIn, drop us a review on your preferred podcast platform, and connect with us on SpreadLoveIO.com. Most importantly, spread love in your organizations and spread the word around you to inspire others and amplify this movement our world so desperately needs.